So they came through the waters of the Red Sea. We've covered that. And things went pretty quickly from there, and they got pretty desperate pretty fast. 3 days' journey into the wilderness of Shur, they came to a place called Marah. Okay? And what was the characteristic of the waters at Marah? Yeah, they were bitter. That's what Marah means, bitter. Okay? That's where it gets its name from. It's kind of like, hey, let's name that place Marah because we want people to know when they come to Marah not to drink the water, right? Okay? It's like a big old sign out front. Well, what happens pretty quick? We're in Exodus 15, verse 24. We've jumped ahead a little bit. So, what do you think is going to happen? Well, the people grumble at Moses. Do we hear them crying out to the Lord? Not in this case. They just went straight to the grumbling. What shall we drink? They're grumbling. And Moses cried out to the Lord. That's who does the crying out to the Lord. And Moses was shown a tree. I'm going to state this a little cryptically. Moses was shown a tree, and he was told when the tree, when it was applied to the waters, it turned the waters of death into the waters of life. In other words, on the third day in the wilderness, the tree from the Lord brought the people's salvation. Do you see that in the story? It's kind of interesting, but that's another study. At the end of that, there's a statement that I want to spend a little bit of time on. It says, after he cried out and showed him a tree, he threw it in the waters, and the waters became sweet. There he made a statute for them, and he tested them. Are we staying up? Yep. And there he made a statute and regulation, and there he tested them. And the question is, who tested whom? Right? I looked it up on Grammarly.com because I'm not quite sure still when to use whom and when to use who, but I think I've got it down. Okay? Who tested whom? And the answer is God tested the people. So there's a lack of water. God tested the people by bringing them into a situation concerning water that they couldn't solve on their own, and he wanted to see their response. That's the test, right? And it's how they responded. How did they respond? Well, they grumbled and complained. Did that affect God's faithfulness in the circumstance? No, it didn't. God was still faithful. That seems to be his character. For anyone that's a person of faith that's walked with the Lord, we have a God that his characteristic is being faithful. And thank God that it is, right? And I don't mean that lightly. So God is testing the people. He allowed a situation of stress. Now listen to me here, because this is one of those statements you could apply directly to you. He allowed a situation of stress in the people's life that they were incapable of solving on their own to see how they would respond. Does God do this even today? Does he allow situations in our life to occur that we cannot solve on our own? When he does this, what is he wanting to see? He's wanting to see how we respond. Will our response affect his faithfulness? Well, it's his character to be faithful. How's that going to play out? I don't know. But however it plays out, his character is a faithful character. When the people respond in faith, or would they respond in faith, or would they grumble and complain with a lack of faith? That's the question. And we get down to Exodus 15, verse 26. And he said, if you will, now notice what he says here. If you will give earnest heed to the voice of the Lord your God, and do what is right in his sight, and give ear to his commandments, keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases that you saw back in the Egyptians. I am the Lord your God, your healer. Did you notice that? What does it sound like, the beginning of that? If you give earnest heed to the voice of your Lord your God? Well, what does that sound like? We're back in Psalm 95. Today, if you would hear his voice. It's the same prescription, right? If you're given the instruction and God has clearly communicated to you and you've heard that at all, If you hear his voice, if you follow his commands, it will take you into a deeper faith instead of a hardening of your heart. So, what is it that God used to test his people in this first episode? It was water, and more importantly, it was thirst, right? It was the thirst of the people, their need for water that was used. And who tested whom? God tested the people. Okay, that's important to coming out of there. Then we're going to go on to the wilderness of sin. It's transliterated sin. The Hebrew word sounds like sin, and so it has really nothing to do with our concept of sin. So try not to get, it's just a place name as far as we can tell. So the whole congregation grumbled at this next episode, right? Where's their grumbling look like? Well, you've brought us out into the wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger, right? Different topic this time, right? What was the first topic? Water and thirst. We might lump them all together, but if you've been really thirsty and not hungry, you know the difference, right? Okay, and vice versa. In 16:3, the Lord says to Moses, I'll give them bread from heaven, and every day the people will partake of the bread and have enough for that day. And then notice what he says. Verse 4, that I may what? That I may test them. So who is testing whom? God is testing the people in this second episode. What's the topic? What's the challenge? It's food. Okay? Good. And then what happens in the story? Well, we get some quail, some meat to add to the bread. That's kind of nice. And then we get a Sabbath instituted in verse 22 of chapter 16. We've covered this earlier in our study, that this is happening before Mount Sinai, so it's interesting that the Sabbath is instituted before the law is given in that setting. Remember what the Sabbath is? According to this class, it's a reminder of rest, a time of rest back in the Garden of Eden where people were receiving instruction from God and following that instruction, hearing the voice of God and obeying it in faith and living at rest under God's commandment. That's what rest is. So it's here after this second episode, this second test where God's testing the people, that he institutes a reminder of rest. Remember, this isn't the way it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be different than what it is, right? Okay, so that's important. God tested the people. It was having to do with food. Then we go to Exodus 17. This is Meribah and Massah. This is our Psalm 95 passage. This is where I like to say all the marbles are. I don't know why I like to say that, but I don't even own marbles. But this is where they are. It's right here in this passage. And as a reader, you should expect something different from this passage than what we've seen previous, okay? As a reader, we have been to Psalm 95. We've already been to Hebrews. We know that it's back here that people are pointing to this episode that we're about to read. There's an expectation as a reader, a heightened expectation as a New Testament reader, that it's here that something different happens. And yet it seems like it's all the same. It seems like it's a lot of the same. So let's try and parse it out and just make sure that we're understanding exactly what's there. It's how the people responded here that's our warning. That's what Psalm 95 said. If you don't do it this way, you have a chance to enter God's rest, is what Hebrews says. Okay? So they traveled on, and there was no water for the people to drink. Okay? That's a little statement in 17:1. There's no water for the people to drink. Do you see it there? What's that supposed to do for you as a reader, having just been through what we've been through in this study? It's prompting a question for you as a reader. Oh, there's no water. It's prompting an obvious question, what I think is an obvious question, but it may not be to you, so I'll drop that language. What's the question that you're prompted to as a reader? The question is, well, how are they going to respond this time? Right? And why would I ask that question with this episode? Because what's the topic? It's water again, right? It's a repeated topic. We've been through water, we've been through food, we're back at water again, And what do the people have a chance to do here? Just what does logic tell us? We have a chance, having seen God's works in this specific area, we have a chance to respond better than we did the previous episode. Right? That's the chance. That's the question that is naturally prompted to you by the way this is written. So they traveled there. There was no water for them to drink. And the author is setting us up. He's prompting us. So in verse 2, the people quarrel with Moses. Oh boy. Okay. We're starting to get our answer pretty quick, right? How are they going to? Well, they start quarreling with Moses. And they said, why do you quarrel with me? And then what does he say? Why do you test the Lord? So let me ask you a question. Who's testing whom in this episode? It's the people testing the Lord. Do you see that is categorically different than the previous two episodes, where it specifically said the Lord was testing them? We come into this episode expecting something different, and I think we get it. Not with the test, not with the response of the test, but with this little description. Why did you test the Lord? That's what's different. Okay? What's the solution to this? Now notice what God says. 17:5 and 6. Pass before the people so they see you. Moses, I want everybody to see you doing this. Pass before. Take some of the elders with you. Then we need some witnesses, right? Because not everybody is going to be able to see you hit the rock. So everybody's seeing you go with the elders. They'll see that the elders were with you. So when you come back with this story and tell everybody that couldn't see it, take your staff. The one that you used back there, he brings out with the Nile, right? What was the miracle at the Nile with the staff? It was a miraculous turning this water to blood, right? It was part of that miraculous thing, okay? What else was the staff involved in, though? I mean, this is a pretty... Snake. Well, it was the snake, good. Off my radar, but now back on. Sorry. No, perfect. It was the snake, it was the Nile, it's also the Red Sea, the parting of the Red Sea. This staff has become a symbol of not Moses' power. This is a symbol of God going with him. It's a symbol of God's power. And he says, take that staff, that symbol of my power, and hit the rock. And what happened? Was God faithful? The people complained. They didn't change their response. They hardened their hearts even further. And yet, God was faithful. So what's significant about this place? I'm suspecting that you already put some of this together. God tested the people regarding their thirst at Marah, the bitter waters, right? They grumbled and complained, and God was faithful. Then God tested the people regarding hunger. They grumbled and complained, and God was faithful, right? We're marching through where we've been. Then God tested them regarding thirst again. And this is critical, I think. This is an area where God had already proven himself faithful in their lives. They had already seen him be faithful in this area of their lives. Does that make sense? I hope you're applying this as I go. They had seen him work in this specific way in their lives before. They had a basis for faith when it came to thirst. Now, the situation was totally different. Before there was a body of water, it was just not drinkable. Here, there's no body of water. It may have seemed dramatically different in the immediate circumstances, but the topic was the same. Do you trust me with water? Was the last time enough to trust me this time, even though the circumstances are slightly different? Do you trust me? And when they didn't trust him, how is that described? That's no longer God testing them, but the tables have turned. Now they're testing God. And it's Psalm 95 that says, don't respond the way they did at Meribah and Massah. It's that response that kept them out of the promised land. Now, some people argue that it was Kadesh Barnea, an episode later, where they sent 12 spies in, that they still had an opportunity to enter the land. But theologically speaking, they didn't. They sent 12 spies in. How many came back with a faithful response? 2. There were pockets of faith, but the majority of people and the voice of the people was a voice of unbelief. That started where? Where was the first time they tested God? Exodus 17. Prior to that, they had grumbled and complained, but God had proven himself faithful, and it was the first episode. It was the first pursuit of an enemy. It was the first thirst. It was the first hunger. God had showed himself faithful through all of those, and then he starts a repetition, a repeat. He starts bringing episodes back up in their lives again, giving them a chance to have learned from their first response, and they didn't. And that's the example that we're supposed to learn from. It's Meribah and Massah that we're supposed to learn from. Now, is it also the rest of their time in the wilderness? Yes, because their responses just continue the same way, right? Psalm 95, God says, for 40 years I loathed that generation, right? And if we take it into Hebrews, that's switched a little bit. They saw my works for 40 years. Both of those are true. That 40 years goes with how long God loathed them because of their unbelief and their unfaithful responses to him. And it also, he was faithful for 40 years and they saw his works for 40 years. Do you see that? That's crazy, but that's my life. And that's your life. And so I think there's some takeaway. It's the example right here that we are warned against following. So today, if you hear his voice, right?